But no, it's indeed a pleasure to host David Grimm tonight at Politics and Prose for a discussion of his new book, Citizen Canine, Our Evolving Relationship with Cats and Dogs. Now, I just have to say, David, that I, as I mentioned earlier to you in the office, am a fanatical cat person. And I know that you're a cat person. You talk about that in your book. So I don't know about the rest of you who are cat people, but I was a little disappointed that the title of this book wasn't Citizen Canine and Citizen Feline. But in any case, the book, I will say, is so wonderful that you're forgiven for that minor oversight. David is the perfect person to explore how our attitudes, attachments, and sense of obligation to dogs and cats have changed over time, but also, and perhaps most importantly, what those changes say about us as human beings and as a society. He's deputy editor at Science and has written for publications from U.S. News and World Report to The Bark to the Financial Times. He has a PhD in genetics and teaches journalism at Johns Hopkins. And perhaps not surprisingly, he brings to the task of this book a great style and skill as a writer. Citizen Canine relies on the story of animals themselves, their owners, advocates, antagonists, and others whose lives and work intersect with them. Each chapter is lively, instructive, and persuasive, presenting different examples and cases of how the place of dogs and cats has changed in our world and also changed our world. Is a dog or cat property, deserving of rights, able to act morally? And what about those pesky owners who think of their pets as people, or at least as extensions of themselves? And I just have to confess that coincidentally, and this is totally coincidence because I made this vet appointment before I had actually read the book, but this morning I might as well have been Exhibit A for one of the kind of recurring themes in the book. I was having to do what I dread most probably in my life, which is to take my two aging cats to the vet. So there I was, fraught and anxious, one might say traumatized, over the idea that these poor, sweet, loyal creatures would have even one moment of suffering. So thank you for addressing my own human behaviors as they relate to animals so effectively in this book. Oh, and by the way, and then I did get the bill and pay it without thinking twice about it. So I'm sure we've all experienced that if you have pets. No doubt the lives, experience, and emotions of dogs and cats are fascinating in and of themselves. They are also, as we learn from this book, a tremendous window on the human condition. That is what makes this book so great. And I really hope you'll all read it and enjoy it as much as I did. And please join me now in welcoming David Grimm to Politics and Prose.
Great. Thank you guys all for coming. It's a great crowd and really nice to see everybody and the dog especially. Sure. And just to address the title issue, the title was a huge battle. Even though the title was my idea, I was it was always sort of a placeholder until something better came along. But I joke that if Orson Welles had made Citizen Feel, the title of the book would have been Citizen Feline instead, but we're stuck with Canine. I love dogs too, but I was hoping for a title that would be a little bit more even for cats and dogs. But as somebody in the front row noticed, there is a cat on the cover. A lot of people miss the cat, but there's a cat right there. And the other compromise was that the word cat would appear first in the subtitle. So anyway, we tried to even it out as much as we could. But thank you guys all for coming. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I wanted to be a veterinarian when I grew up. I've always loved animals, cats and dogs. I grew up with cats. I have cats now, as was mentioned. But I worked in a vet clinic for 6 years, part-time in high school and college, and that cured me of wanting to be a vet. Turns out, as many vets will tell you, being a veterinarian is much more about dealing with owners than dealing with pets, and it turns out that aspect of the job wasn't as appealing to me. So then I decided, well, I'll be a doctor. Then I started to do pre-med in undergrad, and I decided, well, I don't really like this either. So then I decided to be a scientist, and ended up majoring in cell biology and biochemistry at University of California, San Diego. I grew up in Southern California. And then I went to grad school. I was getting my PhD in genetics at Yale, and about halfway through grad school, I realized I didn't really want to be a scientist anymore. But by then it was a little too late. I think it was in my 5 of 6 years of getting my PhD. It was a little too late to change your mind at that point. So I had always liked writing, and ended up finishing my PhD. Was very fortunate to get an internship at Science magazine. about 10 years ago, and that's where I am right now. And I've stuck with science writing. That was the one that was the profession that stuck. But always in the back of my mind, I really did want to do something with dogs and cats. The very first report I wrote in elementary school was about cats. The second report I wrote was about dogs, so it was always sort of in the cards there. And so I wrote a story for Science a few years ago about birth control for cats and dogs. I don't think we're going to have time to get into that tonight, but you can ask me about it later. And then I wrote another story about cats and dogs being used in biomedical research. And it turns out there's a limit to the number of cat and dog stories you can write for Science magazine, and that limit is 2. So I sort of hit the limit and still wanted to write about cats and dogs. So that was somewhat of the inception for the book. And if anybody saw the piece I wrote in Slate yesterday about the high cost of veterinary care and how that's creating dilemmas for owners and pets, the other impetus for the book was our cat Jasper. We have 2 cats, Jasper and Jezebel, and adopting him a few years ago and him going into kidney failure. And I talk about this in the book, but us rushing him to emergency clinic and him seeing specialists and spending 3 days there, and us ended up spending $3,000 on an animal we'd only known for a few months, but had already become like a child to us and part of the family, really got me thinking. And being there in the emergency clinic and seeing people crying and pulling out that checkbook and that second credit card, realizing that I wasn't the crazy cat person, that there was a lot of crazy cat and dog people out there, and really started thinking about how we got to this place, how these animals that used to be wild animals and for thousands of years were really outside animals, and only recently have come indoors, how these animals had become members of the family, and where that relationship is going from here. And that was really the impetus of the book. You know, one of the big things that I really want to do with the book is, you guys may know, especially if you're pet people, there is, I think, literally 1 billion pet books out there, literally, maybe close to 1 billion. So it's a very, there's a lot of books out there, and I decided if I was going to write a book about cats and dogs, I really wanted it to be different than the other books out there. And one of the ways I really wanted to make it different was to really talk less about where we are right now, because I think we can all look around us and we can see the doggy day spas and we can see the expensive veterinary procedures, but really investigating really how we got here. How did we get to this place that we are right now? And also I really wanted to get into what's happening in the eyes of the law as well, which is a lot of people I think are not aware of. You can look around and you can see that a lot of us are treating pets like children and family members. 90% of Americans consider their pets part of the family. And one of my favorite stats from the book, if trapped on a desert island, more than 50% of people would rather live out their days with their dog or their cat than with a human companion. So that just shows you where we're. It's not the crazy cat person, the crazy dog person. It's sort of where society is. But there's been a really fascinating transformation happening in the eyes of the law as well. As cats and dogs have become family in our homes, cats and dogs are technically property in the eyes of the law, which means that they're no different from a couch or a toaster. But there's been some really fascinating movement happening in the legal system, in the courts and the legislatures over the past few decades that have really fuzzed that definition. We're seeing custody cases over cats and dogs where a judge will say, what's in the best interest of this animal? Which home would this cat be happiest in? Which home would this dog be happiest in? Which you would never do for a toaster. Nobody's going to say what home would a toaster be happiest in? Cats and dogs can inherit money now. As of 2000, most states allow pets to inherit money, which shouldn't technically be possible. Cats and dogs are property. Money is property. Property shouldn't be able to inherit property. It violates hundreds of years of property law. We're starting to see so-called emotional distress damages, where somebody will hurt or kill a cat or dog, and owners in some cases have been able to successfully sue for tens of thousands of dollars. These damages are typically only reserved for spouses and children. And as I talk about the book, there's actually been 3 cases in the last few years where dogs have actually been given lawyers in court. I actually opened the book with one of those cases. So we're seeing that even though cats and dogs are technically property, the law is really starting to fuzz that definition of, are they property? Are they people? Are they something in between? And this hasn't happened for any animal in human history, in all of human history, especially human legal history. So there's just a lot of fascinating stuff happening, not just in our home, but in the eyes of the law. And I think we're at this really interesting point in our society where we've bonded with these animals in a way and we've elevated the status of these animals in a way that we haven't done for any other animal. And where are we going from here? And so that's really what the book is all about. It's how we got to this place, and where are we going, and the good, bad, and the bizarre aspects of what the future could hold. So I'm going to read a little passage from the book. And one of the great things about this book, one of the things I really wanted to do for this book was not just sort of sit at my desk and write for 4 years, which sometimes I felt like I was doing, but actually get out there in the country and meet some of the really interesting people and just really have some interesting experiences. And so I have a whole chapter on Hurricane Katrina. It turns out almost half the people that stayed behind during Hurricane Katrina stayed behind because of their pets. The rescuers would come in the lifeboats or the helicopters, and they would say, "We'll take you, but we're not going to take your cats and or dogs." And people would say, "No, I'm staying behind. This is a member of my family, and I'm not going to leave without them." And a lot of those people ended up dying. So I spent a few days in New Orleans tagging along with people who did pet rescue during the storm and in the aftermath of the storm. I spent time with one of the most fascinating things I did was the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, has an animal cruelty task force, which they actually have detectives that go out in the city and they bust animal abusers. And I spent a few days riding along with them and saw some fairly horrific stuff, but very important stuff to show that we've got a part of one of the country's biggest police forces that's actually dedicated to solving crimes against animals, which just shows their status in society. I spent some time at Lackland Air Force Base, which trains military working dogs. We've got dogs on the front lines in our wars that are getting shot, they're getting killed, they're coming down with PTSD, just to show how dogs are playing important roles in society. And just really met a lot of fascinating folks, had a lot of really incredible experiences. And one of the experiences I'm going to tell you guys about is actually going to jail for this book, but maybe not in the way that you might think, and never having been to jail before, but actually wanting to go to jail in Colorado to investigate a really interesting program that they have there that deals with pets and just sort of reflects how pervasive this pet culture has been to society, how it really hits all types of people and all classes of people. So I'll read that. But first, let me drink a little bit of water. And this is the anecdote that sort of starts the book. This is in the first chapter. Oh yeah, I'll do it up here. Are you guys all hearing me, by the way? Is everybody, you want me to talk a little louder? Okay. All right. I never imagined that writing a book about cats and dogs would land me in jail. Yet here I am on a Friday afternoon in mid-September, surrounded by inmates in the middle of cell block B. At the moment, I'm more cold than afraid. The guards have cranked up the air conditioner, and I stand shivering, my arms crossed tightly against my chest. The space is 2 stories high with a drab gray floor, chalky cinder block walls, and round convex mirrors hinged to every corner. The only color comes from 30 dark orange doors that line both floors, each sporting a large white number and 2 narrow slits for windows. A couple of minutes ago, these doors swung open and inmates poured out from their closet-sized cells. Now, they're all around me. One, heavily tattooed with a bald head, tan skin, and a long, ragged goatee, heads my way. He has something in his hand. I'm here by choice. A month ago, I phoned Mark Beckoff, the world's foremost authority on animal emotions, to ask about his work on pets. During our conversation, he mentioned that he volunteers at the Boulder County Jail, just a few miles from his Colorado home. He teaches a class on animal behavior as parts of Roots and Shoots, a community outreach program founded by his friend, renowned primatologist Jane Goodall. Sometimes, he told me, he chats with the inmates about dogs and cats. My interest was piqued. I asked if I could fly out and sit in on a class. He shot a couple of emails to the jail, and I was cleared for takeoff. I met Beckoff in person earlier this morning. A wiry 66-year-old with reddish-gray hair tied back in a long ponytail. He lives in a cabin in the woods about a 10-minute drive from downtown Boulder. After a short hike around his property, we hopped into his car and drove to the jail. On the way, he told me he started teaching the class 11 years ago. The inmates who take it are in transition, meaning they're either coming from a maximum security prison or are about to enter one. I've had everyone from a virtuoso pianist to a guy who killed his step-parents, he told me. One inmate used to act as Beckoff's bodyguard while he was inside. I only needed him once, he said cryptically. After about 15 minutes, we pulled into a large asphalt parking lot surrounded by grass and trees. A small lake was just a few hundred yards away. The Rocky Mountains dominated the horizon. The view was wasted on the adobe-colored structure hunkered in the middle of the lot, a boxy behemoth of tall, windowless walls. We parked the car and headed in. I had never been inside a jail before. On first impression, it reminded me a lot of a doctor's office. Beckoff and I entered a modest lobby where a receptionist handed me a clipboard heavy with paperwork. A vending machine buzzed nearby. A handful of people sat in chairs lining the perimeter of the room, seemingly waiting for their appointments. But the doctor's office vibe quickly faded when the receptionist told me to remove everything from my pockets and handed me a badge with a large black E on it. I would later learn it stood for escorted visitor. Then a burly guard, everyone referred to as the commander, entered the room and led Beckoff and me into the heart of the jail. We walked a maze of narrow hallways, occasionally stopping to stare up at a security camera before a door would open. Finally, we arrived at the command center, a glass room with a couple of guards sitting in swivel chairs before a control panel of knobs and monitors. On the other side was the door to cell block B. Beckoff and I walked through it. The commander closed the door behind us, remaining with the other guards. I'd never felt so vulnerable. And now the cell doors have swung open, the inmates have streamed out, and one is heading straight for me. "Hey!" he shouts, advancing on me in blue scrubs and bright orange sneakers. "I want to show you something." He thrusts an object in my face. It's a photo of his cats. "These are my little ones," he beams. "My wife sends me pictures of them instead of the kids." The inmate, whose name I would later learn is Richard, owns a couple of pit bulls as well, plus a turtle and 3 fish. He begins to tell me about them when another man approaches. This one, named George, is in his mid-60s with short white hair and a Band-Aid slapped across his left temple. He shows me pictures of 2 collies on standing on a stack of tires. "These are my grand dogs," he says. "The one on the left is the fastest dog west of the Mississippi." More inmates crowd around me, more pictures of pets. I feel like a judge at a proud parent contest. "Come on," Beckoff smiles, tugging my arm. "Help me set up." We grab some plastic chairs from the sides of the room and begin to place them in the center of the cell block. The inmates pitch in. Then Beckoff and I take a seat, and everyone else follows suit. Staring out at a motley crew of ages, temperaments, and tattoo patterns, this doesn't feel like any class I've ever been in. But as we start chatting, I find the men surprisingly attentive, gregarious, and well-spoken. Beckoff asks if any of the guys consider their pets members of the family. He's met with an enthusiastic chorus of yeahs. "Our dogs get Christmas and birthday presents," says George, who I learn used to be a lawyer. "Our cats run our house," hollers Mark, a redhead with light crimson skin. "When one of our animals dies, it's like a death in the family," murmurs another inmate named Darren. "We cry like nobody's business." Many of these men see themselves in their animals. Russell, a muscular fellow with short black hair who has been in and out of prisons his entire life, says his dog was saved from an abusive home, just like he was. Me, my wife, my German Shepherd, we're all rescues. We've all had the same life. Matt, in his mid-40s with spiky white hair, says that in here he feels like a stray no one wants. We're outcasts, he says. Growing up, he says, his parents beat his pets. That's not an attitude he's inherited, at least when it comes to animals. "I'll punch a guy straight in the mouth, but not a cat or a dog," he says. "I'll pet my kitten and not think twice about getting into a bar fight." We talk for an hour. The men tell me stories about their experiences, about their dogs experiencing separation anxiety while they're behind bars, sniffing their old clothes and whimpering, about their cats curling up with them in bed when they get out, about how their pets eat better at home than they do in here. They seem acutely aware that over the decades, their status in society has stagnated, while the status of cats and dogs has skyrocketed. Years ago, these guys would have said, "They're treating me like a dog in here," Beckoff tells me later. They don't say that anymore. The commander enters the room and the men fall silent. Beckoff nods to me. We get up, thank the inmates for their time, and exit the cell block. On the drive back to his cabin, I tell Beckoff I had been surprised by how much the men cared for their pets. Given the low value many of them seemed to have placed on human life, I hadn't expected them to hold animals in high regard. He says the opposite is true. A lot of these guys come from broken or abusive homes, he notes. For many, their best friend growing up was a cat or a dog, someone who loved them no matter what. Their pets were the only real family they had. Yeah, I'll take questions.
If you have a question, if you go to one of these mics, that would be great. And I'm sorry to make you stand up.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
We're taping you, so.
That's good. Hi.
Oh, thanks very much for coming and for your fascinating presentation. Could you tell us how you decided on the topics or themes of your book and the areas that you researched and have written up?
Yeah, so the book is divided into 3 sections. The first is called Family, and that's really about how pets became members of our family. We've lived with cats and dogs a really long time. Dogs somewhere between 15,000 years and 30,000 years. They were the very first thing we ever domesticated. And cats probably somewhere around 10,000 years. And for a long time, these were wild animals. Then our relationship with them was very much a working relationship. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. You'll get a few scraps from the table if you guard my house or my hut or protect our village, help me hunt. With cats, it was like, we won't kill you as long as you keep on killing the rats in the field. And this was the relationship for thousands of years. Even though cats and dogs were highly valued in antiquity, in ancient Rome and ancient Egypt, in the Middle Ages, cats and dogs were very much denigrated. Dogs were blamed for spreading disease, and cats were associated with Satan and the devil, so they've been on this really roller coaster ride. So this first part of the book, I really wanted to explore how we got from this place where we had wild cats and wolves to animals sleeping in our bed that we're spending $60 billion with a B dollars on this year in the U.S. alone. And the second part is called Person, and that really deals with the legal status of these animals. 100 years ago, cats and dogs weren't even property. They were considered so worthless that you could steal a cat or a dog, you could kill a cat or a dog, nothing would happen to you. I read about a story in Baltimore where I live, where in the late 1800s a man actually went into a woman's house, went into a woman's yard, stole her cat, was dragged before a judge. The judge was about to convict the man, and the Attorney General of Maryland at the time, who happened to be the cousin of Edgar Allan Poe, said, cats are wild animals, they're not property, you have to let this man go. Stealing a cat was not a crime. So cats and dogs went from being completely worthless in the eyes of the law to becoming property, which they are today, and as I said earlier, to starting to fuzz that definition. So that's what the second part of the book is all about. And the third part of the book is I call Citizen, and that's really taking these 2 parts together and really exploring, okay, if the status in the home is changing so much and the status in the eyes of law is changing so much, are these 2 animals effectively becoming members of society just like we are? And that's where I talk about military working dogs and a lot of the pushback against the rising status of cats and dogs. It turns out that if cats and dogs are like children, then you're, as an owner, you're actually a guardian. And what does that mean if you don't walk your dog 3 times a day, or you don't spring for that $2,000 chemotherapy for your cat? Could the sort of pet protective services show up at your house and take your pets away, just like child protective services might take your children away? So that the last part of the book gets into a lot of the really bizarre and strange complications of elevating the status of these animals. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, and sometimes it's downright bizarre. So that's probably a long-winded answer to your question, but those were 3 aspects that I really wanted to delve into the book. So.
Hi. I really look forward to reading your book. It sounds great. I was just wondering, maybe you didn't really address this, but if you have any thoughts about this. I spend a lot of time in places like Puerto Rico. I live there, and I actually helped start a trap neuter release program down there. And you probably know, but in Puerto Rico, which isn't that far from the U.S., a lot of Puerto Ricans live in the U.S., the culture towards pets, dogs and cats, along with horses, iguanas, everything else, is very different than here. and there's you see a lot of roadkill. There's a lot of stray dogs and cats everywhere on beaches. I mean, it's even been talked about in things like the New York Times. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts or observations about culture.
Yeah, it's a great point, and the book is very U.S. centric, but I do mention, because I don't want to mislead people, that cats and dogs are gods everywhere in the world, because they're not. And my wife and I have traveled a lot in South America. We went to Greece as well, places like Easter Island, where you just see animals roaming the streets, and you don't see a lot of puppies or kittens, which tells you a lot as well. These are cultures that don't spay and neuter, where the animals, even though I think these people care very much about these animals are outdoor pets. And what's interesting is this is where we were 100 years ago. These animals lived outdoors. The cats roamed the neighborhood at night. The dogs slept in a doghouse, or they roamed the neighborhood, and they didn't come inside. And then as we started bringing these animals into our house, that was really a huge paradigm shift, because once this animal's in your house, it's no longer a pet. It's no longer an animal. It becomes a member of the household. It starts sleeping in your bed. It's a member of the family. And so I think a lot of these cultures are sort of where we were. Not to say that they're behind, but I think in some cases we're seeing that. We're seeing in places like China and India, which also have these types of situations, where these animals, as people get more money and that they start to treat these animals a little bit more like family members, they start maybe bring them inside. So I think some of it is just something you see in developing countries that you don't see in the developing world. But there definitely is. It's very stark compared to other countries.
Yes, thank you.
That was my question too. In China, they still eat dogs,
Right.
and in other places they eat horses. But looking at it a different way, if you think it has to do with development, there was a time when people lived with their animals. The animals and the people all lived in the same house,
Right.
for warmth in the winter. And they didn't become pets then. I think they kept on eating the animals that were in the house with them.
Right.
So it's a little more complicated than that.
It is. And actually, one of the interesting things that's really happened in terms of turning these two animals, especially into family members, I think has to do a lot with the world we live in right now, especially in the U.S. and other developed countries. We live in a very industrialized world. We live in much smaller family units than we used to live. We used to live with our grandparents and our aunts and uncles, and now we live in these much smaller atomic families. Divorce rates are through the roof. Empty nesters is up. I think I saw a poll came out the other day that a quarter of Americans live by themselves, which is several times more than it's been in any point in history. So there's this huge emotional void that's developed in the home. And then we've got this tremendous rise of technology in the last couple of decades, where we have not just the internet, pervasiveness of the internet, but social media. Increasingly, our human relationships are virtual. We're friending people on Facebook instead of real life. We're texting people instead of talking to them on the phone. We all go out to a bookstore or a cafe with a group of friends, and we stare at our iPhones the whole time. And I think all this together has created this emotional void. We're longing for this connection. And the cat or the dog in our home, they're always going to be there. They're sitting on your lap. They want to play. They want to cuddle. They're not going to go in the other room and start playing on their iPad. They're not going to tune you out because they're texting their friend. They're just there. They're focused on you. And I talk about this in the book. These animals really keep us anchored to the real world in a way that I think our human relations don't as much anymore. I think that's really helped transform them from mere pets to members of the family.
Do you think for some people they've become substitutes for children?
They absolutely do, and we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Eli.
I'm wondering about the way that the public views tragedies that happen to dogs or cats overseas compared to human victims. Is it simply that, first of all, have you looked at any studies about psychologists or experts thinking about why people seem to care more about a specific story of a dog in a disaster zone or a war zone than a specific individual person?
I mean, I'm not sure that's true, but I do know, for example, in advance of the Sochi Olympics, there was a story about all the stray dogs there and how they were being rounded up, and I think they were being killed. And that actually made a fair amount of news, and people were for a time seemed more concerned about that than maybe some of the human rights stuff that was going on. But again, I don't know if that's true that people do. I think there are some people that care more about the plight of animals, not just in this country, but in other countries. One of the really interesting things when I was hanging out with the LAPD was, sometimes this task force gets some pushback because they're saying, why are we devoting, all this money to this animal cruelty task force? We've got people, we've got rapists and pedophiles and gang members on the street. Why are we wasting money on police officers that track down animal abusers? And one of the arguments this task force makes is that when we bust people for animal cruelty, we're also taking somebody who's beating his dog is also beating his wife and beating his children. Somebody who is abusing his cat is also probably somebody who's engaged in dog fighting, let's say, is also probably often hiding illegal guns, hiding drugs. So I know this is a little off topic, but it gets to the point that I think a lot of this is intertwined. When we think about suffering and we think about helping animals, a lot of times helping animals is intertwined with helping people and vice versa. So.
Okay. Excuse me. My name is Dolma, and I'm a regular here since for the last 1 month. I will not be here for long, for sure. I know we talked about the good things, and I know I totally agree, and how they are used as sensors, and on the positive side. But since nobody wants to tackle the nitty-gritty, dirtiest stuff, I would like to just kind of throw in there are a few here. I wish there were more, but they're listening and it will be used in the future. So that's why I'm speaking this. Do you think it's so important to awaken our population, especially in the United States? We have all these wonderful mass media where we can alert people within a second, versus the whole world where we are now connected, and it's so small now. As they say, there's globalization and this and that, and even myself from traveling from here to India, it's just like 12 hours or 13 hours, whatever. It's like almost going to New York. So did you see, just to give you an example, I think it's been going on for a long time, but if you do know, and if you do not know, since you're very skillful in writing and all that, you can help a lot. And I'm a journalist too. About these Chinese, I don't mean to attack them at all. They consume pork a lot. But did you see those video clips? I didn't see those in the TV, but I did see somewhere else, where they could, be just like small babies. It'll be going on the escalator kind of thing, where they have the chocolate, the Lucy, if you have seen the movie, like those chocolate balls. It'll just go on like that, and they just ping a little bit, and they're dead, and it's so beautiful. And then they'll be dumped, and then the next one will fall. And then, they can chip them and wake them up. And when they can do that to them, I know that it could be done. And even myself, I realize so many body transformations. And when we call, and maybe they're all into that business. So yes, so right. So yeah. So did you address any of those where the animals on the positive side, and also use as an awakening tool?
Yeah, I didn't. I don't really address a whole lot of that in the book. I do definitely talk about animal suffering. That's one of the big things that actually helped actually transform the status of animals. It turns out that as of a couple months ago, South Dakota became the 50th state to pass a felony anti-cruelty law, which means now in all 50 states in the U.S., it's a felony to abuse animals. Now, this usually applies to most animals, but the punishments tend to be a lot more severe if it's dogs and cats. In fact, in some states, you can actually be thrown in prison for 10 years and fined $125,000 for animal abuse. So I know it's a little not solely on topic with your question, but I think suffering does play a lot into this. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, the humans.
Yeah, I realize your book is mainly about cats and dogs, but I think there's an irony that we have this love affair with cats and dogs, yet many other animals in our world, especially cows, pigs, sheep, fish, that we eat are suffering more than they ever have.
Yeah.
And I think there's this ironic dichotomy between our pets and the animals that we eat that are victims of factory farming.
Yeah.
And have you explored that at all, or how do you personally feel about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really, we say, God, I'm an animal lover. I just spent, $3,000 on my cat, and then I'm sitting down and eating a hamburger, and somebody will say, well, you're not an animal lover. You're eating a hamburger, and I'm not coming down on either side on that. But we really draw these divisions in our head between these animals are family, and everything else, whatever, sometimes. But I think what's really interesting in the past, it's really only been in the last 20 years or so that cats and dogs have become family members on a broad social scale, where you start to see these polls like 90% of people view their pets as members of the family. What's really interesting, and I can't prove this, but there's some really interesting correlations with that rising status of cats and dogs. We've seen a real spike in the percentage of Americans that are opposed to animal testing. So a poll just came out, I think, last year that said 54% of people under 30, I think, oppose animal testing now, and that's up like 15 or 20% from 15 years ago. We're seeing a rise in people being uncomfortable with whales and dolphins in captivity. And why is that? Why is all that happening now at the same time that cats and dogs are becoming members of the family? And I think they may be more intertwined, and I think it could be that as these animals become family members and we start realizing, oh my God, these animals can love, and we're bringing up our children with these animals, and in some cases the animals are virtual siblings, that I think we're starting to see, a bit of us are starting to see the world, the other animals through the eyes of our cats and the dogs. When we have empathy with these creatures, I think we start having empathy with other animals as well. So I'd be curious to see if some of those divisions start breaking down. Now, I don't know if that's the case for sure, but I think it would be interesting to keep an eye on.
Hi. I work in education with middle school and high school age students, and right now there's a lot of programs trying to encourage students to take an interest or pursue professions in STEM fields. And I don't know if you identify yourself as a lapsed scientist and now a full-time writer or anything like that, but I just didn't know if you had any thoughts you wanted to share about any stage of your scientific education or career, or if you have any thoughts about, what maybe makes people fall away from science as a profession.
Yeah, for me it was tough, and actually somebody I went to grad school is here in the audience. I don't know where he disappeared to, but he's one of the ones of us that actually stuck it out and stayed in science. But there was actually a surprising number of people in my class that actually left science and went into other fields like law and teaching and other things. But it's interesting. I still love science, which is why I'm a science writer and I'm at science. But I found that at least the research part of it for me was very much more monkey work, grunt work than I sort of felt like I had signed up for, and I felt like I wasn't using my brains as much as I was using my hands, and that's obviously not the case for everybody. And I think a lot of it was always wanting to write and realizing that I had sort of entered a field where the kind of writing I was going to be doing wasn't going to be very creatively satisfying. So I think it's different for different people, but for me that's where the dissatisfaction was.
Well,
Sorry,
yeah.
Nick.
Go ahead.
Hey, hey there, David. So as cats and dogs are becoming, as you said, part of the family and citizens, I'm wondering, is there more ongoing debate about whether or not we should get them spayed and neutered?
Yeah, so this is one of the bizarre topics I talk about towards the end of the book, this idea of personhood for cats and dogs, or giving limited rights to cats and dogs. And one of the things critics pounce on is, well, if cats and dogs have rights, then you can't spay and neuter them anymore. That's a violation of their right to bodily integrity. You can't buy and sell them anymore because you can't buy and sell people. That's as far-fetched as some of that may be. I think we do get into some really interesting legal complications when we talk about, can I spay and neuter something that's now a person, that's now a child? Can I even euthanize them? Even if I feel it's time to euthanize, what if the cat doesn't feel it's time to be euthanized? What am I supposed to do? So I think we're starting to enter a lot of these uncharted waters where things get a lot trickier than they have been in the past.
Great, thank you.
You self-identified as a cat person as well as an expert on.
But
cats.
a dog lover, but a cat person, but a dog lover. I'll put that on my business card.
I think you're the right person though for this question. So I can understand the sort of the long history of closeness, let's say, between humans and dogs, because of the sort of working relationship that you alluded to, and through affluence or whatever, they now are a member of the family status. How did cats come in to this thing? What is it in the past of cats and human relationship to cats explains so many?
Yeah.
I mean, I would call myself a cat person too, so I'm not. This is not at all an antagonistic question. This is
No, it's a great question.
just it's a history question.
It is, and I think dogs, whether you're a dog person or not, I think it's much easier to see how we could form this relationship with dogs. One of the most fascinating things that I discovered in this book was the earliest evidence of cat domestication comes from about 9,500 years ago in the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. And this was a time where farming had just started to crop up. We were living in these farming villages. And one of the interesting things that people did at the time was they buried their relatives under their house. So if somebody in your family died, you would bury them basically under the foundation of your home. So these archaeologists in around 2000 go to this village and they're digging beneath the homes and they come across, a skeleton beneath the home. And lo and behold, about a foot away is the skeleton of a cat. And the two are arranged in a way that they're looking at each other, and the cat is decorated with these carved seashells. And it's really the first evidence we have that cats had really become part of human society and had begun to take this important role. And the reason cats have become important at this time is because when we started farming, the grain started attacking rodents. The rodents attracted the cats came in. And it turns out in this village, there were no native cats. So the villagers actually shipped in cats from the mainland. That's at least the speculation, to help control the rodent problem. Well, what's really fascinating is they didn't just ship in cats. They shipped in foxes as well, because foxes were also very good rat killers. And yet today, cats are actually the most popular pet in the world, not in the U.S., but in the world. No, there's not a whole lot of domesticated foxes out there. So I think what's fascinating about that story is it shows that and I know this is going to get a little hippy-dippy, and I apologize, but I think there's something special about the relationship we were able to have with cats and dogs that for some reason we're not able to have with any other animal. And I know I'm going to get stoned from the people that have birds and horses and fish, but I think there's fundamentally a connection that we can form with these animals that for some reason we can't form with any other animals. One of the really fascinating things about cats and dogs is they're the only pets, and I may get this wrong, but I don't think this is wrong. They're the only domesticated animal. There's dozens of domesticated animals. They're the only domesticated animals that are carnivores, that are sort of the top of their food chain, that at least their ancestors were. And all the domesticated animals are sort of much lower down on the food chain. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, we weren't necessarily at the top of our food chain, but I think these animals had a certain place in their world that was not too dissimilar from the place that we had in our world. And maybe their brain just works a lot more similar to ours than some of these other animals, and then maybe that's why we can form these relationships. But again, all speculation, but it's a fascinating question. Why just these two animals? And why cats too? I mean, why can we form these relationships with cats? So thank you for that question.
Hi. I have another question on animal testing, and I'm going to specify I'm not talking about medical testing, which is a different thing. I'm talking about the testing that goes on for consumer products like paint thinner and cleaners and makeup and all that sort of thing. My understanding, well, let me just say that I know that there are more advanced, more scientifically accurate methods of testing things than testing it on live animals. And across much of Europe, I believe that sort of testing has actually been banned. But my understanding is that to some extent it's actually required in the United States for manufacturers to do this sort of testing. And I wondered how widespread that was and whether you have any idea of whether that will disappear, whether it's being lobbied about on both sides. What can we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that is true. I believe there are some stipulations that certain products have to be tested on animals, at least in the U.S. There is a growing movement from a lot of groups to move away from animal models to start working on things, just doing things in cells or doing them with computers. There's a lot of people that say the stuff that we test on, we've cured cancer 1,000 times in mice and we haven't cured it that many times in people, and that these animals are not that applicable to what we see in people. So I think there's definitely, we're seeing a lot more movement on that end. And again, like the poll I just mentioned a few minutes ago, I think the public is actually getting increasingly uncomfortable with seeing these animals in the laboratory. So I think we will see, and again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I do think we'll see some movement on that in the not too distant future.
So I have one more question if nobody else has one.
I think
Oh, okay, sure.
Well, I would be interested in hearing your comments. You had mentioned earlier about how they've evolved and where that might go with spaying and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Have you theorized about the American Kennel Club and the breeding?
Yeah, and I hope this doesn't get me into trouble either, but we're all friends here, right? Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting, the American Kennel Club has seen this really precipitous drop in registrations in the last decade or two, just dramatic, where where internal memos are basically saying we're going to be extinct, basically. We can all speculate on why that's happening. I think there's been a huge move. If any of you guys have seen advertisements, there's been a huge move to adopt shelter animals. I think the AKC got itself in trouble because a couple years ago at a dog show, it disassociated itself from Pedigree dog food because Pedigree was running shelter pets in its ad saying adopt a shelter ad, and there was a big rift, and then that was a big public relations disaster for the American Kennel Club. I argue in the book, and again, this may get me into trouble, but I think as we see these animals more as members of the family, in the past, we were very concerned. It's like, I got to get the best, it's like getting the best car. I got to get the latest breed of dog. What's a great breed of dog to get, or what's the most fancy breed of cat to get? And we were treating these animals a little bit more like property. Even though we love these animals, it was sort of like, it was like a TV, or, like, let me get the latest, greatest TV. Let me get the latest, greatest type of dog. And now that these animals have become members of the family, I don't think a lot of people have it. They're just like, I want a warm, fuzzy being who's going to love me and who's going to love me back. And even better, if I can save that animal's life by adopting it from a shelter or rescuing it from the street, that even increases that relationship. So I think we're really seeing a lot of purebred stuff fall out of favor. And and again, I don't know what the most recent poll is, but I believe that a majority of Americans now are actually getting their pets from shelters. And you're even seeing places like PetSmart, when they have animals there, these are all animals from local shelters. These are not. And I've seen places like Los Angeles actually banning the sale of cats and dogs in pet stores. This is actually, it's one of many cities that have done that, where you can't actually buy a cat or a dog in a pet store unless it's been adopted. If it came from a puppy mill or came from a breeder, it's actually illegal to buy those animals in pet stores in a number of cities now. So we're really seeing a big change there.
And would they be given away?
So yeah, the only way to get those animals in those cities would be to have them gifted, or to just go to another city and get the animal and bring it back to that city. So.
I have another breeding question. I read recently in an article in the New York Times, a cat zoologist, I think, talking about the trends over time in cats becoming potentially less socialized to people as we have more indoor owned, quote unquote, cats spayed and neutered.
Yeah.
And so the cats that are breeding are community cats who are, valid, of course, wonderful, but less socialized to people. What do you think about the trend long term that this, may be indicative of?
Yeah, that's John Bradshaw who writes
Yes.
about that in his book that just came out, Cat Sense. And there's some issue with dogs too. If all the nice dogs and cats are being spayed and neutered because they're being adopted by homes, and all the cats and all the cats and dogs that are maybe not being adopted because they're too aggressive or on the street are not being spayed and neutered, are we going to sort of have, are we creating a situation where I really don't think I really have a hard time believing that's the case. Domestication is pretty hardwired. Even feral cats, as long as you interact with a feral cat in its first, I think, 2 months of life, these cats become wonderful pets. Same thing with dogs, although I think the window is longer for dogs. So I think it's interesting to speculate about that, but I really don't see that happening anytime soon.
I think we are done with questions. I have one last question, and I also just want to say that if you don't have the book, we have plenty of copies up at the front. You're welcome to get them. David will sign as soon as we're done at the table here. But my question is, in all this research, have you discerned any difference between cat and dog lovers, owners?
That is a great question. No, I don't think so. Let's see. I don't know. I think there used to be stereotypes about especially cat people. I feel like I'm a pretty normal, well-adjusted person, and I'm a big cat lover. But most of the people I interviewed for the book are actually just straight animal lovers. So these are people that have cats and dogs, that rescue cats and dogs, that study cats and dogs. The one real bias is research. There's a lot of research in the last 15 years being done on the dog mind. There's been this explosion. There's actually almost a dozen labs around the world studying what's going on inside your dog's head. Brian Hare, who I visited down at Duke, also just came out with a book. As one of the foremost authorities on that. But nobody's studying cats. Nobody's studying what's going on in your cat's head. Can anybody guess why nobody's studying what's happening in cats' heads? Have you ever tried to bring a cat into a scientific laboratory? That's sort of the end of the story. So it was really disappointing because I wanted to have this whole chapter about sort of pet cognition, what are pets thinking? And like the rest of the book, I wanted to be 50-50 cats and dogs, and it turns out it's 99% dogs in that chapter because nobody's insane enough to try to study cats. I actually talked to a guy. I scoured the world literally for people that study cats, and I found one guy in Italy who usually studies fish. But he did one experiment on cats, and he said we did one experiment on cats and never again. And it gets to the fact that it's not that cats aren't smart. It's that dogs, you bring them to the laboratory, they want to do stuff for you, they want to participate, they want to run the maze, they'll do anything for a treat, and cats want you to go do something to yourself. The nice thing is that we're developing some new technologies like MRI machines where we're able to study pets, and so we may yet get a bit of a peek into the feline mind, but don't hold your breath.
I was just going to tell you actually to take a look at University of Washington in Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah, they are, for good or for bad, they're replacing many of their neurological studies that they used to do on chimpanzees with cats.
Yeah.
Very, very socialized cats, and they started that out looking at other things, but now they're switching a couple groups of those cats to look at cat behavior for its own sake, opposed to, yeah.
Okay, good to know. Very good to know. Good to know. So for the sequel, we'll have that. Thank you guys very much.